Hey guys, how's it going? Long time no see. So today what I would like to do is I'm going to go over some of the stuff that you guys might have seen in the video, hopefully clarify some stuff about natural selection, how that was a big deal for biology and science in general. And then I also want to touch a little bit on genetics and give you guys some pointers for a homework assignment that I'm going to put out. So the things that I want to go over today. So big ideas, natural selection, it's a big deal because it explains how and why species change over time. Genetics, though, focuses more on how species change over time. What are the big rules? And so I don't know if you guys have been following or hearing about this Tiger King stuff that's on taking over social media, but I figured why don't we focus on ligers? Ligers are kind of this interesting situation where when you get a tiger and a lion that mate, they produce this liger that's often like has little bits of characteristics of both the parents, but it's not found in the wild. So we're going to talk about why aren't ligers more common. And so I'll try to bring in some of the ties from like natural selection and some of the genetic stuff to go over this case study. Why aren't ligers more common? So, do species change over time? How? So a lot of people, even before Darwin's time, could see that there are different animal stuff out there. So for example, like around, as I might have mentioned in the video, Darwin and a lot of the other contemporaries of his time, they were finding these different fossils. They were seeing these like large versions of mammals. So you can see down here, we got woolly mammoths. We have these giant camels, giant bison. We have giant anteaters, giant sloths that they were finding fossils of. They could see like similarities between them and modern day versions, which are much smaller. So there comes these questions: do species change over time? How? And there are all sorts of different hypotheses that people had for it. There's one famous guy called Lamarck. He was a French biologist, I think around like the 1700s, just before Darwin, and he tried to explain it that the way animals change is that they acquire these traits over time by their different behaviors, and this sort of made sense. So like think of like, a bodybuilder. If you have someone who's like extremely athletic, seems to work out a lot, seems that their kids are usually healthier and bigger too. But so that's sort of like how Lamarck's idea operated. He thought that the way the giraffes got long necks is because the adults, they would stretch and stretch their necks trying to reach like the tallest leaves and stuff. And so because they grew their necks longer, then that's how their children ended up having longer necks. So you can see how like people would have gotten behind this, but it doesn't quite explain or really make sense. Like if I just exercise or work really hard, is that why my kids are going to be stronger? This is like a common misconception, and it didn't really quite make sense. The other thing that people would see is that I have a picture here of all these different dog breeds. You heard Darwin spent a lot of time studying pigeons. You could look up all these different pigeon varieties, but you could also look at different dog varieties. They all look super different. You got Chihuahuas, you got like the little hairless dogs, you got Great Danes, and you have sheepdogs that have like a ton of hair. All these breeds look really different, but the fascinating fact is that you can still cross any of these different breeds together. They will produce viable offspring. And so are these changes just superficial? How do you tell the difference between like, these different species, or when is it just a case of breed? But we can see though clearly that even though things in nature don't seem to change as fast, I can change what my dogs look like, by selectively breeding them pretty quickly. So how does this work? Why does this work? That's some of the questions that Darwin was trying to answer. So Darwin, as you guys might have seen in the video, he embarked on this historic voyage in the HMS Beagle, traveling around the world, stopped in South America at different couple spots, stopped in like Argentina and got a bunch of fossils of some of these like giant mammals that we had talked about. But one of these big breakthroughs, or one of like the islands, or one of the experiences that he had that really influenced his thinking, was stopping at the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos Islands are this little island chain that are about 500 miles away from the coast of Ecuador. And so you have all kinds of bizarre and interesting animals on the islands. You have these giant tortoises, you have penguins, you have sea lions, you have all these strange plants. But what probably gave like the most influence for Darwin was seeing these different species of birds. So again, what's interesting about a lot of these animals on the islands is that they will have some kind of counterpart on the mainland. So for example, the giant Galapagos tortoises, there is a smaller version of the tortoises on the mainland, but when it came to the islands, it had like a different set of environmental conditions. There were no large predators on the islands. There are these trees that have fruits that are high up. So on the islands, these tortoises grew really large. We then have these mockingbirds. And so you can see that there's like a light green, there's a key here that shows where all the different birds live. So this one on the top left, Galapagos mockingbird, occupies most of the islands. The pink island, Floriana, shows where the Floriana mockingbird lives. We have the hood mockingbird range, which is down here in Española, another island down there. And then also, which is confusing, the Española mockingbird lives on another island called San Cristobal. So because each of these birds occupies a slightly different island, they're not a seagoing bird, they can't really fly super far from each other. It's likely that maybe they just got blown in by a storm or something to the different islands. But once they're on the islands, they were separate from each other. It wasn't crossbreeding. And Darwin started seeing these differences between the different mockingbirds. And that made him start wondering, why are these birds different? How did they get to that point? And so more scientists have followed up on these finches, these Galapagos finches. You can see that these finches, like there's the big finch that has a huge beak and it's made for crushing, like, big seeds. Then you have like these birds with smaller beaks that are meant for kind of picking apart like little seeds. And because they have little beaks, they're able to pick up little seeds better. And then you have like some of these guys that are kind of in the middle. They can kind of go back and forth between them. So Darwin was seeing like all these differences between these birds on the different islands, kind of looking at like the different stuff that they could potentially eat. And you guys also might have heard that he was looking at how this other thinker at the time, Malthus, was explaining that there are more individuals usually in an environment than the environment can sustain. And while Malthus was mostly applying this to human behavior, saying that we're going to have this conflict or this competition between individuals fighting for resources, Darwin applied that then to the animals. And so what the breakthrough was is that, again, these are sort of the four principles of natural selection, or this descent with modification here. But number one is that there usually are more individuals than environment can sustain. So even though by themselves, you could see this in a petri dish, bacteria at first are going to grow exponentially, but eventually once they reach what we call the carrying capacity, or how much they can have, that exponential growth stops. We don't often see this as much in nature because it's very rare that organisms can enter into an area and explode their population sizes. You might see this as invasive species that don't have a lot of competitors or predators. Perhaps you could see this like what's going on with the coronavirus, like that coronavirus, if you guys have been following the cases over time, that's following exponential growth. But usually this doesn't happen. Usually there are things that keep a population in check, and this is usually due to the amount of resources they have, different competitors that are out there, or predators that keep them in check. So usually you have this situation where there are more individuals than environment can sustain. However, there are differences between these individuals in a population that could improve survival. So for example, you look at these different finches. If one finch has a mutation that gives it a slightly larger beak that's better for crushing tough seeds, it's going to be able to eat more and be happier than some of these other finches that don't have those beaks. So individuals that have these better traits are more likely to survive, and they'll have more offspring. They'll be more successful biologically. If these favored trait is inheritable, then that trait should be passed on to offspring, and it'll become more common in the population. So, for example, now let's kind of shift to going back to our lions and tigers and ligers example. So lions and tigers, they occupy the same genus. They're part of Panthera, but they occupy different environments. So lions, again, are mostly common in Africa. There is an area in Asia where they used to overlap. This is like from 1900 that showed you sometimes have these areas where they could overlap with each other in India and parts of Central Asia. But for the most part, though, they occupy different habitats. So that separation explains why ligers are more common. You're not seeing lions and tigers usually occupying the same area. The second difference between them is that we see that because they're in different environments, they evolved to behave differently. So a big unique thing about lions is that lions, among all the cats, are one of the few ones that exhibit this social behavior where they form these large prides that work together to hunt down prey. This is likely due to the different environmental factors that lions have. So again, lions, most of them are in these like desert or arid-like places where you might have tall grass and stuff, or like, the savannas. And so what prey do is prey also, a lot of the prey of lions tend to form these big herds and stuff where they work together. They often congregate around these water holes and these different resources. So you guys click on the link for lions. It can explain a little bit more about how lions likely became social predators. On the other hand, though, tigers, they live in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They mostly behave like most of your other big cats. They're solitary hunters. They're ambush predators. It gets super hot where they are, super humid, kind of like Belize, and so they kind of evolved to be also powerful swimmers. And so that's also something that's kind of unusual for big cats. Most big cats don't like being in the water. Jaguars are another exception, but for the most part, big cats try to stay out of the water. So they got these behavioral differences, and even where there's spots where tigers and lions may overlap, because they kind of occupy the same chain of the food level, tigers are solitary, but lions have these group dynamics. So when they coexist, the lions will often drive away the tigers. Even though the tiger is bigger, faster, and stronger, because the lions kind of have this pack mentality, they are able to kind of successfully control areas and exclude tigers from them. So these behavioral differences often are another reason why lions and tigers don't get along with each other and why we wouldn't necessarily see ligers. That then moves us then to genetics. So one of Darwin's big hurdles that he was having is that he couldn't really explain how these traits were passed from one generation to the next. He spent a lot of time doing different researches, like comparing how humans breed animals. He had all these different factors showing how these traits changed over time, but he couldn't really explain the mechanism behind it or what rules it followed. That's where Gregor Mendel came in. They were contemporaries. Gregor Mendel and Darwin are alive at roughly the same time, but Gregor Mendel was this friar who lived in Austria, and most of his work wasn't really made public until many years after his death. So even though they could have been a great dynamic duo, they never crossed each other's paths. So the way that Gregor Mendel got his ideas about genetics was that he studied pea plants. And pea plants was one of the perfect examples for him because a lot of the traits that he studied followed what we call classic Mendelian genetics, where you have dominant and recessive alleles that are passed on from one generation to the next. And so what Gregor Mendel was mostly doing is that what he found is that when he crossed these pea plants that had certain characteristics, there were certain rules or certain patterns that always seemed to happen when looking at the proportion of the traits in the offspring. And so what he would do is, like you can see in this generation here, where let's say I'm just focusing on the color of my plants. I have a white trait and I have a red trait. I take those two individuals and I cross them, and then in the next generation I get all red individuals. It's okay. But then what Mendel started doing, so let's say this is looking at the color of the plants. When he then crossed the second generation here to the third one, he started observing this interesting pattern, is that the majority of the offspring would have this red trait, but there would be a little portion that would have the white trait. And it was almost always in this 3-to-1 ratio. And so when he started looking at other different traits and doing like these crosses in between them, the same pattern keeps coming up, where you'd have two individuals that have these different traits. If you cross them, you get a generation that has all of the one trait, but then when you cross the grandchildren of that original, or when you look at the grandchildren of that original generation, you have this 3-to-1 pattern of the different traits. And so that's where he got then this idea of these dominant or recessive alleles. So alleles are traits for a particular gene. And so usually, I mean, there's other examples, but usually alleles we have are dominant or recessive. So when the dominant allele is present, it's always expressed. The recessive allele is only expressed if there's no other type of allele present. So for example, in this scenario, the white allele is recessive and the red allele is dominant. So whenever the red trait is present, you're going to have it expressed. When the white allele is expressed, that means that only the genes for the alleles for the white one should be present. We're going to talk a little bit more about this application. I have to pause this video because I only have the free version, but stay tuned for the next video.